Today on the Hubbub Explores podcast, we're going to be looking at travel and whether COVID-19 has changed the way that we get around. We're really lucky to be speaking to amazing guests. We've got Shirley Rodrigues, who is the Deputy Mayor for the Environment and Energy, speaking to us, and also Toby Park, who is the Head of Energy at the Behavioural Insights Team. It should be a really interesting episode. So I'm going to pass over to our guest, Shirley, now.
So we've been thinking a lot about transport and how that might change in the current situation, and I'm here with Shirley. Hi, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi Sarah, nice to meet you.
So I was wondering, from your perspective, how do you think transport might change, and what's the future of sustainable transport?
Well, I think it's already changing. You'll have seen some of the changes that have occurred during the lockdown that we've been all experiencing because of COVID-19 and the big shift. Well, first of all, off the roads. So, for example, on Transport for London, on the Tube network, we've seen ridership fall by 90 to 95%. We've seen traffic fall to by as much as 60%, bus usage falling massively. And obviously this has been driven by people having to work at home or being on furlough and so on. But as we start to come out of lockdown, people are starting to either go back to work or think about sort of participating in sort of active life, but probably very locally. So you're seeing also the way that we have to manage the transport system in a way that allows safe social distancing means the capacity for people to use our public transport network has fallen dramatically, about a fifth of the capacity on the tube now. So we've seen as car traffic starts to rise, and you'll see probably that locally because people don't want to come into central London or they're working at home more. So we're seeing traffic levels rise. So we've got to really encourage people to use bicycling more or cycling, walking more. And what we've done is through the Mayor's Streetscapes plan is try to carve out road space so that we can allow people to do that. And you'll have seen some high profile ones going in, for example, on Park Lane, and just lately the Euston Road, which is fantastic, really showing that that it can be done. And it's been amazing how quickly this can be done. But these are sort of temporary measures to deal with the sort of coming out of lockdown. What we want to do is to see how this goes, but I think from our perspective and from the Mayor's perspective, we'd love to see these to be made more permanent so that we really help get people out of their cars and doing much more walking and cycling, which is much better.
Absolutely. And as well as, I guess, providing more road space and safe cycle paths for people to use, are there any other ways that we can encourage people to get out of their cars and start walking and cycling more?
Well, it's part of it is giving people the information around what is available. So the Mayor's done a lot already in sort of providing cycle routes, segregated cycle routes, but also routes to school and work that are off the main roads, providing that information so that people understand that it's possible. Some of the work that he's done through for example, making, freezing fares, doing the bus hopper fare that pre-lockdown was really popular. So people were definitely getting out their cars and doing much more. And then, of course, things that disincentivise the use of cars, for example, the low emission zone and congestion charges that the Mayor has introduced really highlight the environmental pollution and the congestion impacts of car use, and gets people to think about that. And actually we've seen massive compliance on following the introduction of the ultra low emission zone, which has seen, in 10 months, a massive reduction in the number of polluting cars coming into central London, in the order of, I think, 44,500 vehicles less, and compliance at really high levels, which has been brilliant. But as I've said before, as we're starting to see people not wanting to use public transport because of fears about COVID, we're starting to see cars levels going up, which is why the Mayor has reintroduced the congestion charge, and that's been recently extended, both the hours of operation and the pricing, in order to make sure that we don't start to see those congestion levels start to rise again. So those are some of the ways, I think, that that encourage or discourage, I guess, people from encourage people to use more active forms of transportation and discourage people from using sort of vehicles for unnecessary car trips. And then
100%.
Yeah, and then there's other things that we're doing as well. Things like Breathe London, which is our monitoring network, which is sort of real-time monitoring, so people can start to see where air pollution, what the levels of air pollution are in their areas and at what times of day and so on, so that you can start to make choices about which routes you might use or what time of day you might want to travel around, so that you can avoid sort of the peaks of traffic that might encourage, that does encourage air pollution. And then of course the last thing, but definitely one of the really important things is to keep lobbying government very hard to make sure that, for example, that they include on the environment bill that's going through the World Health Organization target for PM2.5, and that they provide the mayor, the local authorities and other local authority leaders with the powers and funding that they need in order to be able to implement measures that tackle air pollution, but also climate change.
And if members of the public, I think it's been really impactful that people can see the difference in their air quality, because it's invisible. So it's a difficult subject to talk to people about. But throughout lockdown, I think people in London especially have noticed the difference in air quality. So if people are now keen to get involved and to support government in making these changes, what's the best way that they can make their voice heard and support what you're doing?
Well, I think, first of all, I guess I'd say to people, get out there and walk and cycle. Many of the journeys pre-lockdown that people were using their cars for were under 2 miles, which is, quite a short cycle, probably about 20 to 30 minutes walking. So these are journeys that, just think about using an alternative for those journeys. And especially if you're working or, locally now, try that for a start. And then of course, get involved with your local authorities. For example, many of the things that people have been asking for, and I should have mentioned this earlier, is the School Streets campaign. And with the sort of try to get ready for kids going back to school, how do we make sure that that people aren't driving their children to school? So making closing off some of the streets and making it much more safer to walk, cycle or scoot to school, for example. And we're helping to fund a number of those across London, and they're fantastic, because once they're in, people really, people love to use them, children, parents and so on, and locally people realize it wasn't as bad as they feared. So I think we definitely could do more of that. So get involved with your school and with your local authority and ask them about, why can't we have one of these low emission neighbourhoods, school streets? And then the third thing I think is lobby government, lobby your MP about what are they doing to help support London and your locality to be greener. The mayor has set up a recovery board, which is looking at how we build back better in London, and that's anything from our built environment, how we green the economy, how do we make sure that the jobs that we need going forward in London are green jobs, but also it's about getting people out of their cars and using public transport and walking and cycling more. So lobby your government to say, what are you doing as you build out these stimulus packages to make sure they have green strings on them and that they really focus on what people want, which is clean air and to tackle the climate emergency.
Amazing. I think we're going to see some big and fascinating changes. Thank you so much for giving up your time and coming to speak to us. This has been great.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
So I'm here with Toby, who's going to take us through what he spoke about at the last Hubbub Explores workshop, which was all about transport and how we get around. Thank you so much for joining us, Toby.
No problem, thank you.
So together we did a bit of a survey into business travel, thinking about what would happen when we come out of lockdown. And I wonder whether you could give us an overview of what some of the findings were of that survey.
Yeah, sure. So we asked a bunch of employers, not a huge sample, about 28 employers had responded at the time of doing this data poll, but some of them were pretty big employers, so a pretty big number of employees represented by those. The employers were a pretty broad mix, but did sort of skew somewhat towards the kind of organisations that could do some working from home, working remotely already. So not totally representative, but nonetheless some really interesting findings. So, and actually quite profound sort of levels of change, I think, that we've seen over the last few months in terms of how they're operating. So, for instance, the majority, about 74% of employers said that whilst the travel restrictions had presented some difficulties, they felt they were solvable, and actually that this time had forced some quite positive changes. So 88%, for instance, said that the impact of COVID-19 has caused them to discover new ways of working that have been positive. And actually the vast majority, just under 90%, said that they felt that this time had brought benefits to staff. So that's quite interesting. We looked at the factors that seem to influence organisations' intentions to retain some of these changes. A lot of employers are recognising the employee well-being and work-life balance benefits, as well as seeing actually improved productivity, which I think is very encouraging because, of course, concerns over productivity and people's ability to work well at home would perhaps have been one of the incentives that dragged people back to sort of old businesses.
Of course.
That businesses are recognising good productivity is very encouraging. Specifically looking at business travel is obviously more or less on hold at the moment, and actually only 11% of organisations said that they felt that business travel in the long term would be absolutely essential, so that's reassuringly low. When you ask people what factors would drive that decision, again, obviously cost is a big consideration, but again, employee well-being, work-life balance, retention of employees and so on, in other words, not sending people off around the world unnecessarily, seem to be pretty widely recognised. Over 80% of employers cited that, as well as, that said, some recognition that there is a degree of importance attached to face-to-face meetings, to client relationships, sales, and that sort of thing. So that's something which perhaps is not fully resolved. And then looking at sort of plans for the future, so most businesses we spoke to plan to return to the office in some shape or form sort of around autumn, winter. 92% said they're likely to encourage more remote working, which is fantastically high. 76% said they're likely to reduce the amount of business travel within the UK and internationally, and 68% likely to reduce their office space, which I think is quite profound because, of course, reducing your office space, that's a pretty big change for an organisation to make. So the fact that actually over 2/3 of businesses we spoke to are planning to do that is a real sign that things could change quite profoundly.
That's really fascinating. And before, have you got anything else to say from the survey before I ask you some questions? Sorry.
No, I think I just captured the main ones there. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, I will crack on with the question.
If that was within
now, obviously, I've completely lost the thread of what I was going to say. I've got it back. So all of these feel like really profound changes that have happened quite quickly for businesses. And I was wondering whether you had any insights into what the sustainability benefits of things like more of us working from home and smaller office spaces might be.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. And actually, honestly, I don't think there's a really clear understanding at this point in time of what the net impacts might be. Because intuitively, you think, well, if people are traveling less, that's great for the environment. But actually, will they necessarily travel that much less? Because if you're not driving to work or you're not commuting to work in some fashion, you may actually have to take additional trips, to go to the shops and so on, drop your kids off, which you might have otherwise done on the way to work. Similarly, if you've got, say, 100 people working in individual homes at home, heating those homes, that's potentially less efficient than everyone going to one office and heating that office.
Yeah.
So actually the jury is still out a bit on what the sort of net impacts might be for the environment. So it's really important actually we sort of take this opportunity to do that kind of research and encouraging social change in the right direction.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think more and more of us working from home are going to start to notice, especially the rise in energy costs, water costs, those kinds of things as we start working from home. On the business travel point that you mentioned, I wonder, there's a question that's been floating around of lots of companies have said that they aren't going to take business flights anymore, but what happens when your competitor decides that they're going to take a business flight? And might we actually end up in the same position that we were before? And I wonder whether your polling gave any insight into that.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Obviously, predicting these things and predicting how human behaviour unfolds is a risky game. But I think that is a potential risk. On the other hand, there could be competitive pressures pushing the other way as well. In fact, some people in the survey did report that they felt that sort of client expectations or perhaps wider social expectations to be more sustainable that might be pushing them in reduced flights. But also retention and recruitment of good staff was cited multiple times. In other words, do people really want to work for companies that require them to be in the office or that require them to travel around the world all the time? If not, then there's some commercial pressure right there to actually reduce travel. So, these things could well be slightly in tension, and fingers crossed it will pan out in the way that we want it to.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So rather than getting a client, your main aim is going to be hanging on to the really good employees that you have and keeping them happy.
Yeah, I think that's always a key concern.
Fantastic. And I wonder what you might be looking for as we move out of lockdown into some kind of half normality. What are the things that you're most interested in keeping an eye on in these places of change?
I think it's just a matter of, keeping the data rolling in, seeing how things evolve. So you've got a sort of early oversight of how things might change. There is good reason to believe, I think, that some of these behaviours will stick, particularly where there's quite a strong financial incentive to do so. So, where employers have recognised a big cost saving and can anticipate an even bigger cost saving by, for instance, reducing office space, that's a pretty strong incentive and one that would give me some confidence that these changes might linger. Whereas I think where I wouldn't be so confident is where we're just relying on attitude change. And I think people have been perhaps a little bit naive and optimistic in this regard, in that, the COVID experience has perhaps given us a bit of a wake-up call. It's perhaps caused some of us to reassess our priorities, shifted our attitudes a bit with respect to how we see the environment and the importance of the environment and so on. And that's all great and fantastic. But of course, those attitudes have emerged within an unusual context that we currently in the context which reverts back to normality, we may find those attitudes and behaviours also revert. So I think it's important to sort of understand the underlying behavioural mechanism, understand the incentives, understand the mechanisms that are contributing to behaviour change in order to take a realistic view of whether these changes are going to stick or in fact perhaps start reverting to normality.
Well, perfect. Well, that was really interesting. And thank you so much for giving up your time to come and speak to us. If people want to find out a little bit more about the work that you do, is there a place I can direct them?
Yeah, our website, www.bi.team. We've got a blog you can sign up to, and there's sections on there about all our work, including our energy and transport and sustainability work, as well as other portfolios. So please do check it out.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Toby. This has been great.
Thanks so much.